to share with you today. So as I understand it, you should be seeing this title slide for the presentation, Cyber Threats and Mitigations for Maritime and Critical Infrastructure, OT. And in this case, I think we're looking at just how easy it is for our economy to be disrupted, right, and disabled due to threat actors and due to Mother Nature as well. I remember reading about how the water levels, due to climate change potentially, in the Mississippi River had dropped to such a level that barges and ships couldn't make it out, and so they're digging in deeper to try to stop that from becoming a bottleneck. And of course, nation states and even bored teenagers these days are in a position to disrupt just for the fun of it, and they're taking down billion-dollar companies just because they can. So if you've heard of the threat actor Lapsus, for example, these are literally 16-year-old kids in the basement of their parents' house in Oxford, England, that had compromised Electronic Arts or had breached Okta and some of their third parties, as well as Microsoft and NVIDIA and larger organizations. So what we're seeing essentially is a democratization of crime. And I'd like to just give you the brief outline of what we're going to be doing for the slides. And here's my sort of logo slide. It talks about some of the places I've worked in the past. One fun one here up on the upper left, American President Lines. Back in I want to say 19, it was probably closer to 98, 1999. I was working with some colleagues of mine building APL's website. And we actually did a Perl-based, CGI, Common Gateway Interface, if you know that acronym. We did a CGI for the bills of lading for APL to interface with all the trucking and shipping and rail lines. And so this has been something that I've been familiar with over the years. Worked in many different industries, wrote a book for Cisco Press in 2002, launched Starbucks in 1998 for them, working in San Francisco during the whole .com rise and fall. It was a bit of a roaring 20s, wasn't it, for us that were there. Created the first mobile virtual network operator bank for Rabobank called Rabomobile in 2006 when I worked in Europe. Led the team that built ING's DR infrastructure at the behest of the Nederlandse Bank. Built EMS, energy management systems for Nuon and Vattenfall, controlling power plants right around the time when Stuxnet came out. So we had to scan for that and make sure that we weren't infected. All you had to do was change the serial number on the payload, and you would disrupt a power plant instead of disrupt uranium enrichment in Iran. I led the teams that built the trading floor for Rabobank, designed the Chicago Mercantile Exchange's platform and worked there with 10,000 servers and $2 quadrillion in contracts, traded back in 2014 when I moved back to the US. I was the CISO for ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, protecting over $1.2 billion in revenue and 800,000 members. And of course, as Beth mentioned, the CISO for Security Scorecard, a security ratings company, which actually gave me lots of chances to do threat intelligence briefings for the ISACs, including presenting at Black Hat, SANS, Gartner, and as she mentioned, GovWare in Singapore, where I met at least one of the attendees on the call today, Fulvio, where we potentially want to collaborate on additional work on the maritime. Anyway, I'm an adjunct professor teaching at NYU and also the World Economic Forum working groups on oil and gas, as well as the Quantum Security Working Group most recently. So here's the agenda. Let's talk about some of the nature of OT threats and how do these threats differ from IT threats and what I believe is a hybrid model of combined risk attack surface. I don't really think they're converging. I think we need to align our policies, and I'll talk about that in a minute. What kind of threats do we see right now? And then what are some of the 5 essential OT controls that you can implement to help mitigate those? Then I want to talk a little bit about continuous monitoring and how we can't just do assessments once a year and do pen tests once a year. We need continuous visibility. Third-party risk because of supply chain and dependencies. Lots of examples of that with SolarWinds, Kaseya, and there's no end to examples of third-party risk attacks and attack vectors. And then lastly, of course, go through 5 examples of some mitigations and threats and how we share information in this space. But before we dive into that OT discussion and nature of threats, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the nature of cyberspace itself. And here, just for your educational or entertainment purposes. This is a canva.com. The image you see here is a canva.com generated image where I gave it the prompt, Maritime Security showing shipping containers and cranes. And so this is a non-royalty encumbered image, at least that case with Shutterstock, and others hasn't, and Getty Images hadn't played out yet. So if we look at the history of maritime defense, right, and we think back to the mythical Lord of the Rings kind of mythical defense, the tactics, techniques, and procedures against ports were as old as the pillars of the kings, at the northern border of Gondor, shown here. And I think this was called the Argonauts, right? It was a great monument. Each of the two figures have a crown and a helm and an axe in their right hand, and then the left hand is raised as a warning to their Gondor's enemies. But unfortunately, in cyberspace, there are no natural features to be utilized in this way, right? Because it's sort of like an entry point, that's constrained by the mountains. And cyberspace doesn't have this. The theater of operations is entirely manufactured. It's man-made. It's just networked hardware and software. So for the port of the future, OT risk management now has to contend not just with regular risks, but also the additive risk of IT systems. And so let's examine some of those dimensions to better understand how we can protect them. So here, I think about 3 dimensions. I like to collapse hardware and software into just one dimension, because all software has to run on some hardware somewhere. And I think it's an interesting way of describing cyberspace is to ask the question, where are you when you're on the phone? That's cyberspace. And so shown here, the image is a hyperbolic space tiled with rhombic dodecahedra from a 1990 film entitled Knot Knot, produced by the University of Minnesota. It was a guide to mathematical knots in hyperbolic space. And it's a great link in the speaker notes to that video in case you want to watch it, because flying around in hyperspace is like 4-dimensional space. And it's quite fascinating and mesmerizing, actually. But let's unpack these 3 dimensions. So physical, that's your core technical infrastructure, hardware and software. Informational, that's just the content at rest or in transit. It's comprised of numbers, text, audio, pictures, video, things like that. The dimension that I think doesn't get enough attention these days, though, is the cognitive dimension to cyberspace. It's here, I think, where cultural, societal, religious, and historical contexts are brought to bear, and the perceptions of those producing the content and those consuming it. So we think about governments, criminals, activists, hackers. We all think, perceive, visualize, understand, and decide within this cognitive dimension. Cognitive risk, you have things like the shuttle disaster. Launches ago. There were people warning the shuttle, and NASA from Morton Thiokol that built the boosters that said they were subject, to cold temperatures overnight. We shouldn't launch. But it was a cognitive risk. It wasn't due to lack of engineering and proper systems controls that caused that disaster. So that's kind of the example I give of my cognitive risks. There's also too big to fail. There's other types of risks as well, systemic risks that are emergent properties of complex systems where people just don't understand how this stuff is put together anymore. And there's adverse effects that happen that we weren't expecting. And I talk about that in a minute, a little bit later. But how is OT the threat fundamentally different from IT? How do these threats differ? What do we see? So if a vulnerability can lead to a risk, and a threat is the manifestation or active exploitation of that risk, then I think one way to think about it is that OT is comprised of a myriad of protocols and standards, going back to like radio telemetry protocols in the 1940s, that Russians made in Europe. These are the protocols still in use on the power plants that I was working on in Holland. And they have very few states. They're on, they're off, they're in read-only mode, or in their read-write mode, and that's it. IT, on the other hand, has a few widespread protocols, TCP, IP, UDP, but it has a myriad of possible states. And so I think they're the inverse in terms of their complexity and the shape of the risk. So the complexity of OT systems represents an entirely different risk for several reasons. OT-IT alignment, I don't want to call it convergence because I think that's just a disastrous path to pursue. We don't want to just put IP addresses on cranes and IP addresses on other OT assets and say we're done. At this year's B-Sides conference in New York City, Brian Contos delivered a really great session on IT and OT, and he made points that I'll summarize for you real quick. We need to keep in mind that all companies have OT devices, and on average, they have about 3 to 5 OT devices per employee. And that's not even just a maritime organization. That's just any organization. Think of cameras, think of badge readers on doors, thermometers inside of fish tanks, which were hacked notoriously in Las Vegas to get the high rollers database. These are all part of the attack surface. And these OT assets are consistently 40 to 60% off in an undercount whenever someone's itemizing and thinking about how they can be attacked. And on top of that, the threat actors are actually using OT to maintain persistence. Why? Because there's no CrowdStrike agent running on your RTU. And it's easy for the bad guys to realize they're going to get quarantined and expelled from the laptop. And so they establish command and control, or C2 presence, by moving into printers, moving into cameras, and moving into your firewalls and appliances and other devices, OT devices. And why? Well, 50% of OT devices have default passwords. Some devices, you can't even change the default password. And that's a very different shaped risk than what we're used to in IT. And of course, 74% of all of those 50 billion or so OT devices have end-of-life firmware, which means they have vulnerabilities that could be patched but haven't been patched. And so the Russian FSB, they created something called Fronton software, which is used in DDoS attacks for botnets. And they try to encourage you to pay your ransom by DDoSing your infrastructure as well with these zombie devices. But they also use Fronton for creating disinformation campaigns. And so I have a link to a Nissos.com report about this particular botnet capability that was liberated, I guess you could say, by another group of hackers that stole it from FSB. Now everyone has access to it. And then I have a link to the Brian Contos deck and YouTube recording in case you want to follow up on that later. But the nature of threats, this is an experimental slide. I'm seeing if it lands, if it helps communicate. This slide is trying to visualize some of the shape and nature of that risk. So when an OT device is in a read-write state, that's when it's vulnerable to malicious control. And that's what happened in one of the Saudi Aramco facilities, that it was in a read-write state. The bad guys brought Triton malware in against it, and they were able to cause a situation that would have led to a loss of life. This is like a hybrid kinetic kind of warfare, cyber and software that can kill people. And so Triton malware, there's a really good write-up by FireEye that provides some excellent data around ICS, industrial control systems, and malware targeting those efforts. Often these are remaining on your infrastructure for years undetected. They definitely move low and slow to avoid detection. And an OT device, like I said, has basically two states, open and closed, if it's a circuit or a switch or a valve or a pump. And for IT devices, these states, you can manipulate them, of course, when they're in read-write mode. So that's one nature of the difference. And then here, if you look at the device counts, according to Brian's research, there's about 10 million servers globally and about 5 billion laptops. These can all be attacked through phishing attacks, malware, other types of vulnerabilities. But there's 50 billion OT devices. And so the attack surface, I just put a orange V for vulnerable into every single one of these grid areas. So there's really only a small space, right, when you're in read-only mode that OT isn't vulnerable. And you can extract data, like you said, you can install new firmware, you can be able to persist after reboots, all sorts of attacks that hit this infrastructure. So hopefully this captures a little bit of what I'm looking at, trying to convey here. The IT infrastructure gets hit first, right, via email, smishing, or vishing. But then the OT infrastructure provides that persistent hidey hole for the bad guys. In some of the latest waves of breaches, I think a risk-based approach to remediation needs to include whether or not a vulnerability is exploitable. Don't just go after highs and criticals, because it's a waste of your time and effort. Most companies only have the ability to patch about 10% of their vulnerabilities, according to some of the research we did with Scientia at Security Scorecard. So if you can only handle patching 10% on average of your vulns, go for the ones that actually have exploit code in the wild. Don't just go for everything that has a higher critical. We don't have enough headcount, don't have enough resources to do it. And so I think a really great fundamental OT mitigation, given the nature of these OT threats and how they're slightly different, keep IT and OT networks segregated. Change the default passwords, disable and block Telnet and FTP and other clear text protocols and other ports if they're not used. And of course, apply any of your available firmware updates. And if we just did that, it's not sexy, it's not like quantum resilience and things like that, but it is the basic table stakes for running a secure infrastructure and keeping bad things from happening. So let's see, we're about 12:19. So how do these threats differ? They basically differ on intent of the attacker, opportunity of the attacker, and of course the capabilities of the attacker. So in terms of intent, some of the threats are just smash and grab. These are your typical criminal organizations, right? They have their own budget, they have their own ROI. If you looked into the Conti ransomware leaks that happened, you can see they have employee of the month, they have hiring problems, they have all sorts of things that a regular company has. As ransomware and threat actors get more mature, they become more specialized. And so you have initial access brokers that are selling dark web tokens to your Slack and to your logins for your passwords on your platform. They find ways to bypass MFA. And so they're specializing, right? There's people that do ransomware as a service, and those are separate from those that are actually doing the initial access broker. And so you can disrupt that by making it more difficult for them to get at you by having a good security posture. Opportunity, if you're too difficult to attack because your security is good, they're going to move on to another target. And so blindly merging IT and OT networks and asset management increases the opportunities, I think, for the bad actors. Other threats, APTs, advanced persistent threats, they have a very express intent on breaching your security and getting inside. So like I said, they play low and slow, like Cozy Bear, APT 29, as it's known as, which was the SolarWinds breach. I think they had an abundance of breach targets. They didn't think that they were going to get like thousands and thousands of organizations through that attack. They probably had to sell off some of the breached entities to their bad guy friends because there just were not enough bad guys out there to take over, the Department of Justice, 17 Attorney General's office, NVIDIA, what was another one of the major ones? FireEye themselves, right? That's how we all learned about it. And of course, FireEye had the excellent transparency and principles and ethics to share that information with us and say, guess what? We just got breached. This is how they did it. Now everyone knows about Cozy Bear and SolarWinds. And there's still a lot of fallout coming for the next few years from that breach, where we'll learn about even more repercussions of that action. What else? Many of the people that were breached by SolarWinds, they didn't even have log files turned on. So when they were contacted by the FBI or other organizations, CISA, they couldn't even tell if they were actively currently compromised by the Russians because they had no logs. So they couldn't even tell if there was command and control traffic reaching out to all of these infrastructure that they were using. Living off the land, it wasn't living in Russia, right? The command and control targets that they had compromised were living on AWS, on Azure, and on DigitalOcean and other cloud service providers here to make it look less suspicious. And of course, so if you can't even tell if you're breached, you're not in a knowledgeable state. You need observability, you need logging. Others, like I said, like Lapsus, they only have notoriety in their mind. Some of them don't even ask for ransom or money. They wanted NVIDIA, for example, to turn off gating of graphics cards, right, for GPUs to do Bitcoin mining. And so it was almost a social justice attack against NVIDIA. And they released the source code so that people could buy those GPUs for those gaming graphics cards and use them to mine Bitcoin. And so these script kiddies are doing it for the lulz. What kind of threats do we see? GPS spoofing attacks, port call APIs being abused. A lot of folks don't even have an API firewall. Why would you open up all of the innards of your organization and not even have a firewall capability? Rate limiting, throttling of connections, and of course overriding poorly written code that was supposed to only be talked to by a friendly client. Now most of these APIs are part of the digitization effort. Everyone's getting access to them. More and more APIs are becoming exposed. I think it was an Akamai report that said maybe 87% of all traffic on the internet is just API to API. It's not even humans anymore, right? Your phone is talking to the APIs, the apps on your phone are talking to APIs for other phones. That's how Google Maps knows how to call you a Lyft or an Uber. So I think that's an important element of the future of mitigation. Typical vulnerable assets, password reset, application portals, ECDIS computers. The password reset one we'll talk about for the example of Port of Houston and the 0-day that happened there in 2021. Ransomware, of course, the IT infrastructure. I won't go too much into it now, but there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what happened with Colonial Pipeline, because it was not OT that got attacked or breached. It was IT. It was a nomination server, and that's what they exfiltrated the data, and that's what they used as an extortion play. Colonial Pipeline had backups. That wasn't the issue. They paid the ransom because they didn't want the 106 gigabytes that was stolen to be published on the dark web. Of course, open source software supply chain is a big deal. All sorts of bad guys are joining open source communities, engineering a backdoor. I like to call this a sub-zero day because they're creating the vulnerability, waiting for it to release production, and then they exploit it. Example of that was event. I think it was called Event. It was a Node package manager vulnerability, and they just knew that this was used in Bitcoin wallets. And once it reached production, they siphoned off millions of untold millions of money from those organizations because they were attacking the open source supply software. And then, of course, insider risk and threat. We all have to deal with that. There's been a really good example of Ubiquiti routers where someone was sentenced, I think, to 6 years in prison because he was the DevOps engineer. He exfiltrated the data, created a Bitcoin ransom for $2 million, and pretended that there was a breach. But he actually stole the data himself, and he was disgruntled, and now he's in prison. Another example would be 9 years for a former Microsoft employee who stole $10 million in stored value cards for the Xbox store and bought Bitcoin and a house and a Tesla with it. 9 years in prison for his sentencing. So anyway, there are privileged malicious insiders, and then there's accidental as well. But anyway, so the data and the information hubs, maritime organizations are creating a lot more information and storing a lot more data. Think about the energy company. The energy company used to send out a meter reader to your house like once a year, maybe twice a year. And then they would figure out and true up and figure out how much gas you used or electricity. Now you have 5-minute time series data being collected by smart meters. Those smart meters are embedded Linux devices. They can be hacked and attacked as well. And so there's just so much more data coming in. And of course, I can't get away from mentioning the geopolitical elements as well. Think of the stuff that's happening in Port of Virginia, buying those ZPMC cranes from China for $61 million, and the potential of those to have backdoors and sensors that are tracking shipments and reporting back, for potentially nefarious domestic and economic reasons. And then, of course, cosmic energy. This was an energy sector threat that was referenced in a Mandiant article recently. The slide notes have the hyperlink. It's amazing because what they do is they affect and infect your Microsoft SQL database, and then they start issuing OT commands over the bus to the OT infrastructure. And so like I said, it's a combined attack surface. We can't really think of them as separate, although we really ought to segment them as best we can. And like I said, China and the geopolitical tensions. There's a really good link in here to the VirginiaBusiness.com article talking about the Fed's concern about this. I think Chris Wolski was quoted in there, who's the CISO at Port of Houston when it was attacked. I spoke with Chris prior to preparing the slides on his event. And I think the perspective is assume compromise. Assume that there is a backdoor in all of your devices and that these are all untrusted. And maybe you load up some software from ABB from Europe on that crane instead of the software that comes with it from China, just as an example. Let's see, nature of threats. These are the 5 essential OT controls. Now, forever we've had, the CIS top controls. It used to be top 20, then it became 18. Nothing was particularly tailored for OT. And so we kind of had some useless controls floating around and people trying to apply them as frameworks. So these are the 5 controls that SANS white paper written by, among others, Rob Lee, the founder of Dragos, CEO and founder of Dragos.com, who I met through my World Economic Forum working group. And I have a link to the white paper and their webcast recording talking about these. So you really just need good incident response, right? But it needs to be tailored to ICS, Industrial Control Systems, or OT. You need to have a defensible architecture, aka segmented. Don't let everything talk to everything. Printers should not be on the same network, right? Printers are promiscuous. They speak every protocol. They let you connect Telnet, FTP, all sorts of protocols. Printers are bad in terms of network attacks. Then ICS network monitoring. You need to be able to see what's happening, observability. Then, of course, secure remote access. Make sure it's MFA. You're using SSO. And then, of course, risk-based vulnerability management. This, to me, is really important. You can't just go for vulns because they're high and critical. If it's not going to be exploited, you don't necessarily need to patch it. The likelihood of it being exploited is something Michael Reutman was doing at Kenna Security for a while. He created something called EPSS, Environmental Predictability Security Score. So think of it as like CBS scores, but augmented with a whole bunch of AI machine learning to figure out which ones are going to eventually turn into exploitable vulns. That way you only have to go after about 30 or so critical controls that are in your total list of vulnerabilities and exposures, and only patch the ones that could actually end up leading to a breach. And when Kenna Security got acquired by Cisco, Cisco brought in all of their incident response management and digital forensics case study and data, and they improved the training of that machine learning model, and they got to, I think, 65% coverage or something. It's really, really great. I don't have the link to that in here, but I'll add it later. The next thread that I wanted to touch on is a famous quote that I like to share from Heraclitus, an ancient Greek philosopher and historian. You can never step into the same river twice. To me, and it goes on and say, for it's not the same man and it's not the same river. Now take the pronouns out and make it more modern. This is, I think, a good analogy for security, right? It's constantly changing, like the flow of a river, the sound, the color, the risk of security is changing on a daily and intraday manner. And this is not AI, this is not machine learning hype, this is not a large language model. This is like OG InfoSec going back to 500 BC. So some folks, I think, want to sit on an inner tube with a six-pack of beer and they float lazily along on the winding oxbow of the journey of their digital river of security. But other people want to strap on a helmet, head straight for the classified rapids, and get to that next stretch. So you need to know what is the appetite for risk and for transformation of your company, and don't try to advance too fast, and of course don't go too slow. Some people go slow because it's their nature, but of course the bad guys pivot and move really quickly. So how do we keep a better visibility into that river of risk? Continuous monitoring. I spent 2 years in the World Economic Forum working groups just trying to get the word continuous inserted in front of the word monitoring and make that a best practice, and it cascades its way down from the World Economic Forum to the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. Eventually it's going to show up on your board, and your CISO will be asked, what are you doing to do event-based assessments? What are you doing for continuous monitoring? Are you adhering to these 6 new principles for modern governance of resilience? And I think that continuous monitoring, we can't do periodic assessments. Like I said, you can't just send out a questionnaire to your vendors once a year and say, hey, Okta, have you been breached in the last 12 months? And of course, if you send it out in July and they were breached back in January, that's really a last minute where you want to do shields up, right? Oh God, cut off access for Okta. What happened? So you need continuous monitoring. It allows for reassessment. If you do event-based assessments, then you can scale to have thousands of companies as a part of your portfolio. And that's why I like security ratings, and that's why I worked at Scorecard for several years. We have customers like Intel there that were monitoring 20,000 vendors continuously. It's like having your finger on the pulse of all of their security postures. And you don't have to deploy an agent. You just use all of the Nmap scanning that's happening of the internet. And there's a really good posture, and letter grades. Is it a score drop? Do they go from an A to a B? Send them a questionnaire. If there's a breach event, of course you want to send them, were you a part of Move It? Were you a part of Log4j? All sorts of vulnerabilities need to be interactive and event-based. You can tailor the assessments you send them. You don't have to send them the SIG full, 1,000 questions. Nobody wants to answer 1,000 questions over and over again once a year. And you can maintain really small VRM teams. Intel doesn't have to have a 300-person vendor risk management team because they use things that are automated, right? Self-assessment of risk and exposure. It can't continue at this leisurely pace of annual questionnaires and pen tests happening just once a year. We need to have more frequent assessments, and we're going to have to automate it. And to do that for hundreds and thousands of vendors, you need to know the weakest link will be attacked, and you need to know which of your vendors is your weakest link. So I think we need a shift, in observability, a significant shift, and we need new tools and techniques for making sure that we can operate effective governance and compliance from a more modern and informed approach. So when we talk about third-party risk, I thought it's useful to fill in, well, wait a minute, what is first-party risk? What is second-party risk? And of course, nth or fourth-party risk, your third parties have vendors. That's the last category. So I take 4 dimensions I like to share here: attestation, awareness, trust, and management. So attestation. Colonial Pipeline had performed a self-assessment back in 2020 prior to their breach. What would have changed? Right, because you had senators banging on the table saying, how come you didn't do this assessment, right? Number 1, it was optional, and 2, nothing probably would have changed. They would have said, yes, we have everything we need to protect our infrastructure, we're good. And of course, they weren't, right? Lots of bad things happened because of Colonial Pipeline. People were hoarding gas, they were driving off from a gas station with a kiddie pool full of it, the car bursts into flames, the person dies, right? This is real world weirdness, due to, like I said, This idea that attestation is an important element. Awareness, who can afford to scan and monitor all of your vendor APIs and websites and certificates and expirations of those and services? During COVID, some of the California SSL certificates expired. Data transfer didn't happen. A bunch of people got COVID because they didn't have awareness as to the monitoring systems and software that have been set up. So there's a lot of cascade effects here. Awareness, like I said, trust. If zero trust architecture means never trust, always verify, then for what values of always are practical? Do we simply insert 3-factor authentication, 4-factor authentication, 5-factor, ad infinitum? It feels like inflation. It feels like a Saturday Night Live skit, right, where they said, oh, we're going to have a 5-blade disposable razor. Back when Saturday Night Live did that skit, it was kind of funny, but there are now 5-blade disposable razors. We can't just keep adding on layers like this. We need fundamentally different methods of trust. And then, of course, in management, when the 2000 TEU Ever Given lodged itself sideways in the Suez Canal in March of 2021 for 6 days, the whole world realized that a supply chain is not just 3 links. It's not you and your 1 link upstream and you and your 1 link downstream provider. It's the entire ecosystem of risk. And so we have to think about methods for understanding that. Otherwise, the entire ecosystem can be hijacked and sabotaged. And of course, I list out here some of the differences. First party, you have self-attestation. You have complete internal awareness, or at least you should. The dimension of trust comes through control. That's why you have your on-prem data center. You have one neck to throttle, that kind of vendor management, and you have enterprise risk management as your domain. For second party, you have customer attestation, and you have first-hand but partial awareness. They see your website fail, right, when it goes down or when it throws an error, but they don't get to see all the other nasty stuff that might be happening on the back end. And then trust is built, of course, through familiarity and brand loyalty, and we have contractual risk management, right? The terms and conditions you clicked on when you buy a plane ticket online or order a book or something from Amazon Prime Day. Third party, external attestation. We love to go to an external, because you don't want some internally testing it, because they could be biased. They could only test the things they know are broken or the know are strong. And that's why we rely on external attestation for third-party scanning and assessments. But you have a very incomplete awareness of what's happening. And trust is through impartiality, right? And then, of course, vendor risk management is the sweet spot for that. And, of course, your vendors trust third parties and fourth parties, and that's where a lot of these breaches are happening these days. Peer attestation, minimal awareness, trust via proxy. Some people didn't even know they were using Kaseya software when Kaseya got breached and used their remote managing and monitoring software to destroy and deploy ransomware, right? The actual monitoring software was deploying the ransomware. All right, so let's see. We got a couple of minutes left before I want to go to Q&A. So these are the 5 examples I wanted to share. Move It, Port of Houston attack, the DNV Ship Manager ransomware attack, which is cloud, the OOCL Durban in what's it called? Kaohsiung City in Taiwan, and then this lovely example of Antwerp's container theft from 2012. So the Move It vuln, or the Move It data, this is a data harvesting attack. So Move It is file transfer, security transfer software, and we're all suspect to it because our third parties have data, and maybe they use Move It and you don't. But you could still need to reach out to your vendors when this Move It was declared with a joint advisory from the FBI and CISA. And you want to make sure that your not so well defended vendors, have answered that question. Do you use Move It? Did all of your company data, or all of your university data, or all of your what other kind of data? I guess personal social media data get harvested. Port of Houston, this was an IT entry point, but we think they may have been targeting OT systems, or maybe just enterprise supply chain tools to know who was shipping what and how much value there was, and potentially disrupt that. Because if you don't know what's in your manifests, right, you can't ship things, even if the ships are ready to sail. And then, of course, the active systems, you can't figure out where to sail if you lost that system. The DMV Ship Manager software, and I would mention the LastPass password vault breach, shows how cloud services can be a concentration risk. It's basically a honeypot for bad actors. Why wouldn't you want to go and attack LastPass and steal 30 million vaults from 30 million customers, and then try to crack them offline later because you've essentially bypassed MFA? So if you have a live service on LastPass, you may ask for that token, right, from an authenticator app or from an SMS or from an RSA token. But if they have a copy of your vault, they can try to throw brute force attacks at it all day long, and there will be many breaches coming forward and have been already from the LastPass theft. And of course, it was just a dumb idea for someone to put the backups of prod on a dev environment, because the hackers never actually got to prod. All they did was attack the SRE, the DevOps engineer. They got his dev credentials because they installed a keylogger on his personal computer, so not even a company asset. So BYOD is a problem in all industries and all sectors. And of course, they got on the dev and said, "Whoa, cool, we found what we wanted. Let's take it." And so they took the backups. So the Durbin collision demonstrates, of course, how impactful human error can be. But imagine, what if the malicious behaviors happened here instead of a simple human mistake? What if the root cause was someone sending two ships to the same berth, and they're both navigating and they collide and they knock over a crane? And we'll take a look at that in a minute. But let's take a look at a couple of these in depth. So Move It, May 31st, 2023 event, unauthenticated SQL injection attack. So you didn't have to log in to exploit the software. Privilege escalation. CISA and FBI released an advisory on the CLOP ransomware gang exploiting it. Hundreds of companies and thousands of servers were exposed. And this was a 9.8 CVSS score. A day later, of course, June 1st is when the joint advisory came out. So CISA and FBI are really getting good at issuing some of these. Certainly when they see 100 companies call them up and say, "Hey, we just got attacked by CLOP ransomware, and it looks like it was this particular CVE." So they help make sure that we're all aware of that. So what is the mitigation for this, right? Learn how to patch your software within 24 hours when it's urgent. Like a 9.8, that's actively being exploited in the wild for software like Move It. Make sure you have a process and approvals in place to do that. Monitor for anomalies, and if possible, set up egress and egress firewall rules. Most people think of a firewall as an ingress device, but really an egress is how you catch a lot of this command and control traffic from the bad guys. Then the Port of Houston attack. This was August 19th, 2021. A zero-day exploit of Manage Engine from Zoho Software. It's a self-service password portal. Chris Wolski presented this at the 2022 Port of the Future conference in Houston right after the session that I gave, and he described the event in detail. It's a really good story because it was they thwarted it. They stopped it from spreading. So what do you need to mitigate for this type of attack? Well, you need to have EDR, endpoint detection and response. You need to be able to know what's happening on your infrastructure and to be able to isolate servers and devices within a few minutes. Yes, the bad guys can move laterally from patient zero within 18 minutes is one of the fastest threat actors. And so if you can't even monitor every 30 minutes, you've already lost. And of course, learn how to ask for help. This was something that Chris presents on. He says, go to the Coast Guard, go to the FBI, go to CISA, go to the MTS ISAC. These organizations are there to help add some of the elements and puzzle pieces to help you figure out what's happening. Because again, this was a 0 day. This was a fully patched server, completely monitored. And Chris happened to be in the middle of his one-on-one at 9 a.m. when the attack happened. If the bad guys had attacked at 9 p.m., totally different story. But instead, they were able to notice it, stop their one-on-one, and you'd think Port of Houston would have hundreds of people protecting it, right? It's a lot of the critical infrastructure. No, it's only like a 3 or 4 person team, and like the story, like I said, could have been quite different. And they admit they got lucky. They had a plan, they followed it. Luck, of course, favors the prepared. So this is a picture I took of his slide. I asked him if I had permission to share it with you here. This would have been the lateral movement, but they blocked it. And then this is the timeline, the race against the clock. Again, a fully patched server, actively monitored. Even in this situation, things can be difficult. The Coast Guard and the FBI were contacted, and they helped provide some of the pieces. Like, oh yeah, we know this is probably the Chinese, this is how they're doing it, and this is how you can mitigate it. But of course, the vendor didn't come up with a patch until December, and they were attacked in August. And of course, some weird thing happened halfway in between, which was CISA disclosed the breach on a September 23rd Senate committee hearing. And so the Port of Houston actually had to quickly publish something. I think it's useful and important. It's critical, actually, for us to share information, but we need to be a little bit more graceful in collaborating and sharing and communicating when we're about to disclose, because Port Houston got really slammed by the media as soon as that event got discovered. And I think it should have been TLP Amber. It shouldn't have been disclosed to the Senate, in my opinion. And I've spoken to folks that said that CISA acknowledges that that was not the most graceful engagement that they had. But we learn and we get better. Then lastly, the DNV. Oh wait, I have 2 more. The DMV ship manager was January 7th, 2023, around 70 customers impacting over 1,000 shipping vessels, and they have a global market share of about 21% of any maritime vessel. So this obviously is a concentration risk like we talked about. We want to use digital, cloud-based, modern services, but we need to continuously monitor them. And you need to put your own configurations and pull them and perform backups. You need to de-SPOF. If you've heard of the acronym single point of failure, you need to de-SPOF against concentration risk by having and testing alternative providers. So think of Slack, think of Salesforce, think of Teams, think of Atlassian Confluence or Jira. All of those are pretty much too big to fail categories providers. But even Facebook can fail horribly. They were doing a BGP configuration for Border Gateway Protocol, a really great security improvement, but they misconfigured it, and they caused a really bad day for about 6 hours, where at least 4 billion humans couldn't do anything because Facebook was down, Instagram was down, and WhatsApp were all down, just due to one configuration change that they did that was incorrect. So we're really dependent, obviously, on this. And I've got links, again, in the slide notes, which I'll share with anyone that wants a copy. And then this tugboat, actually, it wasn't a tugboat. It was the Durban, and it collided on June 3rd, 2021, with the YM Constancy and a gantry crane. The cost of the two affected cranes, $21 million. And Taiwan reported, that this happened, and it was weird because it was like, a human error. I don't actually have any good suggestions to how to mitigate human error, but imagine if this was malicious, right? Like I said, spoofing GPS, people are using GPS spoofing in order to violate sanctions. So you go to Venezuela, you get a bunch of oil, you send it to Russia. Someone thinks the ship is in Venezuela, they can see it, but the GPS says it's in the Caribbean. And so this is one of the elements that I think we have to work out, hardening some of these protocols that are used for GPS and having better systems of assertions of where something is and what it's doing. And then the example here, I think I was able to click on the video and just show you real quick. Whoops, no, gotta go back. That was the second to last one. This is a short clip that I found of the actual crane collapse. And again, a little bit of software, a little bit of hacking, you could easily make this happen, in Tuas, in Singapore, or Port of Houston, Port of Long Beach, Port of New York, all sorts of risky scenarios here. And that was just human error. What happens when the bad guys actually try to do bad things and not just, like I said, mistakes. And then the Antwerp, beautiful story from the folks at Pentest Partners in UK, June 2022, 2012 event. The ERS system was abused, the electronic release system. Edifact was likely hacked into from one of the agent terminals to get the PIN. Apparently, you could just show up in 2012 at the port in Antwerp and type in a PIN code, and boom, very expensive, untraceable cobalt briquettes get added to your truck, and there's no delivery, there's no signatures, there's no paperwork, and so obviously that was a very naive implementation of what to do for creating this extra capability, right, of having digital release codes, and the ERS system was implemented. After this attack, after these two containers were stolen, they've since put in additional authorization, authentication. But we found out about this one, or Pentest Partners found out about it, because there was a legal document that disclosed some of the discussion that happened in the case, where one of them sued the other for non-delivery of the goods. And then there was an appeal, and the appeal had even more information disclosed about how people had been sent malicious PDFs, and the e-discovery of these reports and communications wasn't fulfilled because no one had actually gone to PwC to do an investigation, and the forensics by the local police had yielded no response. But apparently there was a NAS, network attached storage device, that was deposited in the office that was discovered in 2014, and no one knows how long it was there. And it was snooping and listening to all the traffic, so it could have picked up the codes that way. So what's your mitigation in this threat scenario? NAC, network access controls, it's called 802.1x, perform security designs. It just doesn't allow any device to show up on your network, plug into an RJ45 jack, and suddenly it's on the network. It allows you to put certificates on the devices, for example, and do walkthroughs. looking through rogue devices. A packet squirrel, for example, is a tiny little device, no bigger than a pack of cigarettes. You put it behind a printer or behind a wall TV, and it masquerades, steals the MAC address, and can snoop and even bypass NAC. So you need those physical walkthroughs. And again, network segmentation, egress firewall rules. These are ways to stop the bad guys from taking data off your network. So how do we share information? How do we do more things like this webinar, teach more courses, get more people in the world cyber aware, cyber savvy, going from cyber curious and cyber afraid to maybe cyber confident? Well, obviously there's some drivers. One of the drivers for this is digitization. It's the fall convention, right? By January of 2024, we need the maritime single window. That's going to be a challenge because we need to do it, but it takes years to implement some of these changes and improve some of the communications and information sharing. And so I think all declarations have to be exchanged between ports electronically starting in January. And there's tons of references and links in here. I just had one other slide about the maritime single window and the IMO, right? This is sort of the United Nations version of the Maritime Security Center. And lastly, these are some of the places you can go if you already don't know about them. The IMO has a knowledge sharing center, the Coast Guard, the FBI's InfraGard, CISA, MTS ISAC. And I think we're all running in danger at the moment. And this is the international flag and symbol for, hey, you're running into danger. Batten the hatches makes no sense anymore. Why? Because there's never a time when the digital hatches are not going to be battened, right? To the best of my knowledge, there's going to be no smooth sailing ahead for anyone, anywhere, anytime. So we have to assume compromise. And we have to believe that the Chinese are potentially adding backdoors to semiconductor components, 5G appliances, gantry canes. But we need continuous monitoring, assume breach, and interrogate and certify that hardware and software and see what it's doing. And address some of these cognitive and systemic risks that are emerging from the complex dependencies that we've been creating as we digitize and transform our economy and our critical infrastructure. And the last slide here is obviously Maritime Security Center at Stevens has these courses coming up, October 12, Jan 11, April 11th for the one-day course, the two-day for the Coast Guard's coming up September 21, 22, and the course I'm developing will be out sometime in the fall. And so if you'd like a copy of these slides, you'd like to reach out. This is not malware, this is just a mail to link. You can point your camera at it. It'll generate an email to me saying, hey, please give me a copy of this presentation. So thank you so much. I think I ran a little bit over, but I would love to entertain any questions that folks have and to stop my share and hear what you thought or what this made you think of as we talk about mitigating OT risk.
Thanks, Mike. That was a lot of material to cover. So we are a small size group, so you can unmute yourself if you have a question, or you can certainly post it in Q&A, but I see Gary prepped and ready to go. Gary, do you have a question for Mike? Wait, we can't hear you. Can't hear you, even though it says you're unmuted. Oh, still no. Oh, okay. Well, Gary's getting that worked out. Anybody else? Question, comment for Mike? Okay, I can't hear you either. So let's see. Let me see if I have to unmute you guys. Maybe I have to do that. No, Gary, it says that you're unmuted. And Fulvio, let me see real quick. Maybe we're not going to let you talk. Hold on. Maybe you can. No, Fulvio, it says that you should be able to talk as well.
Can you hear me, Beth?
Yep, I hear you, Barry.
Why?
I'm not quite sure, Barry. Gary, can we try you again? Nope, not working. Barry's working. You're all not working. How about if we post in Q&A real quick or in chat? Or Barry, maybe you have a question to kick us off, and I'll go back end and see what I can work out.
I'm sorry. Gary.
Okay.
Gary's
Okay. Okay, great. So Gary, Mike, can you see his post in chat?
Yeah. Yeah, he was saying, can I elaborate on my distinction about convergence versus aligned alignment. I picked this up from Chris Warner from GuidePoint Security, who's been doing OT and ICS conferences and presentations for a very long time, and he's been involved in the industry. And he was saying that convergence gives you the wrong feeling. Like I said, it's just slapping an IP address onto an asset and saying, okay, now we have digitization of critical infrastructure. And I think that's a very facile, shallow approach. And that's why I want to try to change the language we're using and say, let's talk about aligning OT's policies with IT's policies. Because when the IT sysadmins come in and say, oh my God, you're using Windows XP? And it's like, it's perfectly fine as long as you don't put it on the internet, right? It doesn't have to be a patched operating system. Oftentimes you need something that can run on 1 gig of memory, and you don't need Windows 2019. So I think it's useful to think about convergence. Mindless convergence is sort of assumed, and that's why it's a bad thing. And so we want to leverage the existing safety history and track record of ICS and OT, and to not have it just be completely subsumed, because I think you're familiar, we've talked about this, right? We don't want to be just assumed and say the only people that know anything about risk are the IT people, right? Certainly OT has been around for years and has a totally different life cycle, 20, 30 years for some of these devices, right? Yeah, so he said, I differentiate between digitization and digitalization. A PDF bill of lading is digital, but it's not convergent. Yeah, good point. And a term the telecom industry has been using for 30 years. Yeah, I think IT and cybersecurity are often a little bit overly proud of their come to save the day heroics, and they don't borrow from these other traditions well enough. I've been working on evangelizing something called security chaos engineering, which emerged from Netflix. Netflix had this culture where they actually built something called the Chaos Monkey, which went into their AWS infrastructure and just randomly started ripping out load balancers and configurations and servers and storage to prove that they were fault tolerant. And that's how we build resilience. We have to actually experiment with failure. We have to embrace failure. And so this idea of risk aversion and fearing failure, I think, needs to go away. And that's why I like the idea of breaking down the IT ownership of risk and say, no, it's a shared alignment of policy and practice that we need to try to affect. Kapil is typing, what is your view on the security and age of AI for growing OT threats? Yeah, I think that AI is just an amplifier. It gives everyone an administrative assistant that can help them summarize an email. It can give everyone, democratized access to Cliff Notes. And if you want to come up to speed on a subject, in 5 minutes, you can type in a pretty good prompt and get a pretty good result back. Of course, hallucination is a problem. But in terms of OT threats, I think that AI is going to enable the bad guys to come up with some novel ways of attacking. And I think that novel use of the new tool is something that the defenders are going to take a longer time to get around to figuring out. The innovators, the bad guys, red teams, and malicious actors, they're always coming up with the next clever angle that no one ever expected. So I think AI will just amplify that. And like I said, it's democratization of crime. Anyone can say, okay, type in a PowerShell web shell, and then suddenly you have a completely undetectable, anonymized bit of code. And anyone can write exploit code now by using these Copilot tools. And so I think it really just spreads what was there to more and more threat actors. And like I said, bored teenagers are one of the things that's really causing grief for Mandiant and other investigators these days, because it's not even a nation state, right, or organized crime. Fulvio, OT is focused on availability and maximizing the production. It does not tolerate downtime. That's true. It's got very low tolerance for, as opposed to IT, which goes offline all the time and people just get used to it. While it's desirable to redesign, upgrade, update, the operators are reluctant to do so. Yeah, I think at least 50% of the ships out there, I think that was from one of your articles, right, Fulvio? 50% of the ships out there are like at least 15, 20 years old technology on them, and if not more. And it just keeps increasing because the life cycle on these devices and assets is totally different compared to computers, which have a life cycle and amortization of 1 to 3 years. Usually limited, cyber threat awareness is part of that risk. This means besides awareness programs, cyber resilience solutions should be fool resilient. Yeah, one of the things that I thought might be useful to mention related to what you just said, we're always talking about security awareness training, and IT people come in and talk to non-IT people and say, you got to learn not to click on emails, right? But a computer is a clicky machine, and well, of course you're going to click on things because that's what it does. But really, I think what we also need is business awareness training, where we teach cyber people how to understand the business better. And so business awareness training is a nice turn of phrase, and make sure that we don't just be the Department of No, that we come in to enable business and enable this digital transformation of shipping and maritime and other critical sectors without putting us at undue risk.
Okay, Mike, I don't see any additional questions in chat or Q&A. I do invite you to reach out to Mike directly if you have any questions. Do you want to put the QR code up one more time, Mike?
Yeah, sure. And if you'd like a copy of the deck, want to follow up, I think that's a good way to do it. So
yeah,
there we are. So thank you for your attention today. I appreciate it. Beth, thank you for inviting me and to evolve the content that I want to put into this course to help us avoid some really bad things that are headed our way.
We look forward to adding your course to our portfolio. All thanks for your patience today. I think I just posted in, or I know I just posted in chat. Next time we're going Zoom. Microsoft was, or Teams was not working in our favor today, but really do appreciate your participation. Please reach out, take a look at our course offerings, and we welcome you to join us in our courses. So stay tuned for additional webinars. We look forward to continuing to keep you engaged. So have a great day. Thanks for joining us. Take care, everyone.
Cheers.
Hey, Mike, I'll give you a call shortly. Okay, and Gary, I'll talk to you shortly.